Um, Very good morning. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to welcome you to this workshop. I mean, uh, it's an honor and privilege for a number of reasons. One, just seeing the people around this room. First of all, I want to kind of put on record the appreciation for the Center for Policy Research and especially on behalf of the Lands Right Initiative for all the support and cooperation that all of you have extended to us over the years intellectually in so many different ways. Particularly in a project as complicated as land acquisition in India. This project would not have been possible without the kind of intellectual contributions of you. And I think as an institution, we see it, obviously it's kind of a significant achievement for Namita and her team. But it is also very much part of our kind of collaborative efforts, and in particular, Norwegian Research Council and Siri Gloppen, who's been, I think a kind of intellectual mentor to CPR on these issues for a number of years. So we deeply appreciate, and I really hope we take this as a collective conversation. I also want to obviously thank and congratulate Namita and her absolutely wonderful team for putting together this report. As you know, this conference is in a sense sort of two distinct but related parts. There is the discussion of a report on land laws, which is a innovative attempt to use Supreme Court databases to actually understand the nature of land law litigation, at least at the level of the Supreme Court. And then there is a work which Namita will also tell you more about on scheduled areas, extremely important work, which is actually the first sort of really first rigorous attempt to actually look at the practices of law and land in scheduled areas. So we'll hear more about that work in the afternoon. But I'm really just delighted you're all here. I'll have to slip out at some point during the proceedings in the morning, but I'll be back in the afternoon. And I'll just turn it over to Namita.
Thank you, Pratap, and thank you also for mentoring the project over the years. Let me just, on behalf of the Center for Policy Research Land Rights Initiative, extend my welcome to all of you and echo our words of gratitude to all of you who have been part of the development of this project and have been with us along the way. So as Pratap mentioned, the plan for today is essentially to present research from two projects of the Land Rights Initiative. The first one is on land acquisition. The second is on land rights in the scheduled areas. And this project is a collaboration between the Center for Policy Research and the Center on Law and Social Transformation, which is headed by Professor Siri Gloppen here, who is a professor of comparative politics at the University of Bergen. And so the plan for the day is that we present to you findings first from the land acquisition project and then have a discussion and deliberation on those findings. And then in the later half of the day, extending into tomorrow, we have a presentation of our findings on the land rights in the scheduled areas project and a discussion and deliberation on the same. Let me start then with sort of giving a little overview of how this project sort of came about and what are the main findings of this project. As we know, there has been intense social and political contestation over land in India, especially with respect to the law of land acquisition over the last several years. And I'm very happy to see Mr. Ramesh has just walked in as well, who championed the land acquisition law in 2013, which essentially came about as a way of responding to much of the contestation around the sort of inequities as well as the inefficiencies embedded within the land acquisition process. So, this, after the law was passed, there were the social and political contestation on these issues continued and is still continuing. And this contestation is not just in the form of legal contestation, which has been the subject of this report, but also in extra-legal forms, including violent conflict over some of these issues. So the relevance of examining these issues very much there today, and yet we felt that especially on a macro level there wasn't enough systematic data on the causes of disputation and conflict regarding land acquisition, and therefore in order to meaningfully evaluate legal and policy initiatives, whether it was the LARR Act of 2013 or the subsequent laws that are being passed attempted to pass through the ordinance as well as through state laws, we thought in order to meaningfully evaluate these initiatives, let us try and get a sense of the main causes of disputes regarding land acquisition over the years. So we attempted to do this through this study, where essentially we've looked at all Supreme Court cases on land acquisition from 1950, which is when the Constitution came into force and the Supreme Court was created, until 2016. So it's a study of 66 years of disputes over land acquisition. We're all familiar with the controversy around land acquisition, but to quickly sort of go through the trajectory of the law on land acquisition. The British colonial state enacted a number of laws of land acquisition in pursuance of its power of eminent domain, which basically allows the state to compulsorily or forcibly acquire land belonging to private persons upon the fulfillment of three conditions. The first, that there should be a legitimate public purpose for which the land is being acquired. Secondly, that there should be payment of just compensation. And third, that the acquisition must be pursuant to a procedure established by law. The requirements, the twin requirements of public purpose and just compensation are primarily there so that no private individual should have to disproportionately bear the burden of supporting the public good. So that's why it has to be a public purpose and should be compensated accordingly for the loss that they have suffered. The requirement of procedure established by law essentially is to prevent misuse of, prevent the scope for arbitrariness on part of individual executive officials in conducting the process. So it has to be according to law. So the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 was in force for almost 120 years before it was replaced by this historic law, which was the Land Acquisition Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013, which came into force on January 1, 2014. And but within a year of its coming into force, it was actually sought to be amended substantially by the Land Acquisition, the LARR Ordinance, which was then repromulgated twice in 2015, and because there wasn't consensus within Parliament to pass this into law, and eventually lapsed on August 31st, 2015. The parliamentary committee, which was constituted to review the bill, has been given its 8th extension now. It is unlikely it will submit any report. But the government, when it was not able to push the ordinance through into law, basically said that because acquisition and requisitioning of property is a subject in the concurrent list where both the parliament and state legislatures have jurisdiction to actually pass laws, they suggested that state governments can go ahead and amend the law according to their needs. And Tamil Nadu was the first of the batch. They amended the law in 2015. Telangana amended certain provisions of the law applicable to certain irrigation projects in the state, where they deviated from some of the requirements of the central law in 2015. Gujarat and Rajasthan have passed amendments in 2016. Karnataka and Maharashtra are considering amendments to the law. So just to sort of go through the process of land acquisition, because that will be sort of relevant to have in the back of our heads as we evaluate the results. Essentially, it's a 6-stage process. The government notifies that land is needed for a public purpose. This is widely known as the Section 4 notification, as the section of the Act under which it is issued. Then the collector holds an inquiry into objections as to why this land should not be acquired, raised by persons interested, which basically means title holders, but actually the term is broader under the 1894 Act. It includes any person who has an easement interest in the land or who can bring a claim in compensation for the land. Then, upon completion of this inquiry into the objections, if the government still decides to go ahead with the land acquisition, it must issue a final declaration that land should be acquired for public purpose. The collector then proceeds with the acquisition, marking and measuring the land that needs to be acquired. Then he's supposed to hold another inquiry about compensation claims pursuant to the acquisition, and then pass a final award of compensation and also apportion it between multiple claimants. Because as we know, there'll be many people who may have a claim in the land. Finally, the government takes possession of the land. That's when also the land vests with the government and pays compensation to the claimants. So it's basically a 6-stage process, but there is something called the urgency exception in the law, which allows the collector to bypass some of these steps and simply go ahead and take possession of the land without sort of holding an inquiry and hearing people about the acquisition and awarding compensation. So the main contentious issues with respect to the Land Acquisition Act which really led to the massive push towards its amendment, were as follows. First, that it recognized only title and not livelihoods to the land. Second, that there was so basically it excluded a whole bunch of people who would lose out when the land was acquired but had no voice in the process or no share in the compensation. Secondly, it included an inclusive definition of public purpose, and the Supreme Court had interpreted this to mean that public purpose was an elastic term which the government sort of was the best judge of, and so it had a very differential review of the requirement of public purpose, and it was believed that over time it basically included a lot of purposes that were not legitimate public purposes for which land was being acquired. The third was that the functioning of the Act, even though the Act's text actually said that they must pay market value compensation, that the functioning of the Act essentially resulted in payment of less than market value compensation for the land that was to be acquired. And finally, the procedure was considered not sufficiently participatory because while people were to be only a certain group of people could be heard in the process, and there was no social impact assessment of what was going to happen with the acquisition and so on, and there was no consent. Obviously, it is a compulsory power, so it was non-participatory. And finally, it was believed that there was a widespread misuse of the urgency clause, and therefore, we needed to amend the law. So the important changes that were made by the LARR Act, the Act is a very long piece of legislation with many things, but these are sort of the main changes that were made directly to respond to some of these concerns. The first was it broadened claimants who from title holders to all those who have an interest in the land, including livelihood losers. Now, this was actually a long-standing demand. The Law Commission report of 1958 had mentioned, that this should be done. Actually, the Bihar government had raised this issue before them. So 50 years later, we've actually sort of managed to do this. The second was that it provided a very detailed sort of a list of public purposes, extremely detailed, included a whole bunch of purposes within it, both public, private, and so on. Then it increased the compensation to twice. So basically, as I said, under the Land Acquisition Act, it only said market value. It didn't say how that market value was to be calculated. The new law actually provided some guidelines for that. It said that it provided a compensation formula, according to which it had to be twice the value of average of registered sale deeds in urban areas and 4 times in rural areas. And so this actually includes the solatium amount, which was the sort of solatium is Latin for solace, which is to be paid to land losers because as a solace payment for the fact that they are losing the land. Plus, it had requirements for rehabilitation and resettlement in certain cases. It also introduced requirements of consent and social impact assessment as part of the procedure for acquisition of land. It greatly limited the invocation of the urgency clause only to situations involving India's defense, national security, or for emergencies due to natural calamities. Any other emergency has actually to be approved by Parliament. And finally, it retrospectively applied the LARR Act to pending acquisitions under old land acquisition laws if certain conditions were met. And that's under Section 24. So when we sort of went about creating this data set, the idea was to collect all relevant cases. So in our initial searches, we collected about 3,066 cases, out of which we then removed 1,797 cases, which were falling in 3 categories. One, they'd just been picked up in our online searches but didn't have anything to do with land acquisition. Second, they had to do with land reform laws, which, during the 1950s, there were a series of laws passed as pursuant to Zamindari abolition and other land reforms, which also involved acquisition of land, substantial acquisition of land. But since those laws corresponded to a particular moment in history and were aimed at large-scale social reform as opposed to individual acquisitions, therefore they were not so relevant to the story that we were telling, so those were also taken out. And finally, we also took out from the set all cases involving claims relating to the constitutional right to property, which extends to land but also other forms of property. So after that, we were left with a data set of 1,269 cases over the last 66 years. And the interesting thing that came out was that 1,150 of those cases actually involved a central statute of land acquisition. And only 203 cases involved state statutes. But but it's interesting because what we found was that if you look at the laws that were implicated, there were 15 central laws and there were 87 state laws that were implicated in this litigation. And but next slide. When we look at the incidence of the Land Acquisition Act of 1894, it was pretty extensive actually. So 87% of all litigation was with respect to the Land Acquisition Act. So therefore, much of what I'm now going to say is going to be a sort of straightforward comparison of the issues under the Land Acquisition Act and what's happened under the LARR Act and so on. Yeah. So First, we wanted to bring a sense of the process volume and timelines of litigation, just so that we understand the inequities and inefficiencies embedded within both the process with the executive as well as with the judiciary. So there are the Supreme Court of India, which is the highest court of appeal and also the one of two constitutional courts, has both original and appellate jurisdiction. As part of its appellate jurisdiction, you can go and appeal from decisions made by the High Court if they involve a substantial question of general importance or a constitutional question of law. You can also go directly and appeal following a unique provision of the Supreme Court that's called the SLP, or the Special Leave Petition. You can directly go from any court in the country. So generally, the process of appeal under the Land Acquisition Act is that the collector, once he makes a decision, the collector is the representative of the government, the administrative official who makes the decision. There is an appeal provided under the Land Acquisition Act to the civil court, which is called the reference court under the Act. So after the decision is given by the reference court, it usually goes then to the High Court and then to the Supreme Court. But under SLP, you could directly also go to the Supreme Court. So if you look at the litigation under these provisions, we find that over 60% of all litigation has been with the SLP power. So it's about 2/3 SLP and 1/3 the civil appeal process from the High Court. Also, what we find is that these cases involve bunches of petitions. So we actually disaggregated the bunches. What happens is that the Supreme Court, in order to ensure expeditious disposal of cases, will actually bunch matters together, which involve the same factual issue or the same legal issue. And so when we disaggregate the volume of litigation, 1269 cases is a lot, but when we actually disaggregate it, we find that 53%, which is a majority of all cases, involved bunch matters, and it comes to actually 13,884 petitions that we've looked at. So now, why I mentioned the Section 4 notification, which is basically the initiation of the land acquisition process. If we look at the time that is taken between a judgment that is delivered by the High Court from the time that the notification has been issued, it's a period of 15 years. From a High Court judgment to a Supreme Court judgment, it is an average period of 6 years. So that overall, from the initiation of the land acquisition process to a decision by the Supreme Court, it's 20 years. Now, we must note here that it's not as if people are going in appeal to the courts right away. So this doesn't only mean that this is just judicial pendency, because a lot of times what happens, Section 4 notification is issued, but the other processes take time, or that, even though land has been notified, it hasn't been taken possession of, or awards of compensation are not made for several years into the process. A litigant will only go to court at some point during that process, and it's not possible for us to tell from the data when that actually happens on an average. But it still gives, but at least the High Court to Supreme Court figures, which, still give us a sense of the extent of pendency, which is very high, 6 years on average. Now, these numbers will be lesser for certain cases and more for others, but it shows both the inefficiencies within the executive process and also within the judicial pendency. If you look at the decade-wise average judgment time period, we find that the time period between the notification and the High Court judgment has been only increasing over time, and between the notification and the Supreme Court as well. But the interesting thing is that the time between the High Court judgment and the Supreme Court is actually going down since the 90s. So the Supreme, and we think it is because in the 1990s, the Supreme Court reorganized its docket and basically, did a lot more expeditious disposal of cases. So this suggests, and in fact, if we have the year-wise data, we find that 1995 and 1996 are the years when maximum number of cases have been decided by far. So this brings an important finding for reform of judicial cases within other courts, is that, reorganization of docket might actually result in speedy disposal of cases. Now, from the judgments, we tried to figure out, and this information wasn't available in all the cases, that when was the actual land acquisition proceeding initiated? When was the Section 4 notification? And if you look at this graph, then, from 1950 to about 1990s decade, it is a steady increase in the amount of land being notified. So basically, the government has only been increasing its sort of acquisition of land over time. Why the number sort of goes down doesn't mean that the acquisitions are going down, but it's just that because we've seen that there is an average judgment time period of 20 years, that the post-millennium acquisitions, not all of them have been decided by the Supreme Court. So once those cases also are decided in the next few years, if they're going to come up, we expect this trend to be an increasing trend. Basically, there's an increase in the amount of land being acquired and the amount of land being litigated. So, in terms of the 5 sort of core legal issues that were the object of substantial contestation, what we found was that there were essentially 2 categories of legal claimants that were coming before the court. The first category consisted of those who accepted the legitimacy of the land acquisition process, but they were seeking fair compensation. They felt they had not been fairly compensated. And the second consisted of those who did not accept the legitimacy of the acquisition process at all. Now, it is not to say that these categories are independent of each other, because there was some overlap, but these were sort of the broad categories that were coming out. Within those who were questioning the legitimacy of the acquisition process, there were 3 subcategories. The first was those who were challenging the constitutional validity of the land acquisition law itself. So, just for non-lawyers, so when you are challenging, Parliament enacts the law and the executive sort of acts pursuant to that law. So when you challenge the constitutional validity of the law itself, you're basically saying Parliament hasn't followed the rule of law as laid down in the Constitution. And for those who, for the second group who accepted the legitimacy of the law but alleged procedural irregularities in the acquisition, here they're saying that Parliament may have followed the rule of law, but the executive has not followed the law that they have passed in application to them specifically. And finally, there was the third category who questioned the legitimacy of the purposes for which land was being acquired. Again, there is overlap between all 3 categories, but these were the sort of 3 categories that came out. Now, within the first category, those who sought fair compensation but were not necessarily challenging the legitimacy of the acquisition process, 63% of these cases were actually were of the total data set. So out of 1269 cases, 805 cases actually were challenging the quantum of compensation that had been awarded to them. So almost 2/3. Whereas the remaining 1/3 was was the other category, where they were challenging the legitimacy of the acquisition process itself. So within this category of 805 cases, we found, so essentially under the 1894 Act, there were 4 kinds of components, 4 components of the compensation process. The first was the market value of the land. Second was the additional solatium payment, which under the older law was 30% of the market value. A solatium is the solace. Then there were 3 interest provisions under the earlier law. And it's very interesting because the earlier law provided an appeal to the lower court, and in every case the lower court was required. This was an amendment that was made in 1984, and in 1984, pursuant to this amendment, in every case that went to the court, they were required to pay 12% of the market value. So there was a very high incentive to litigate for a person, and it's curious that the law actually had such a provision like that, because it is creating the incentive to litigate within the law. So people would go to court and get that 12%. But in addition to that, if the collector, for instance, took possession at a time, he's supposed to give compensation at the time he takes possession. If he doesn't do that, then he's also required to pay interest on the time period for which he has not paid the compensation and after which he pays. Then, when the court orders that compensation must be paid, if he doesn't deposit it in court, then he again has to pay interest till the time period he actually pays. So there were 3 interest provisions. So he's supposed to pay they're supposed to pay market value, they're supposed to pay interest, they're supposed to pay solatium. And even though there was no mandatory provision under the 1894 Act to provide rehabilitation, the collector in his discretion could do so. He could rehabilitate, but there was no mandate. So unsurprisingly, because there was no mandate, there was no legal claim. So we see very little litigation with respect to the rehabilitation aspect, only 1%. Now, if we look at, so out of the 805 cases, we did not have information available for all these categories for all cases. But for instance, in 547 cases where we have information available of the original award by the collector, we found that in 86.5% of the cases, actually, there was a positive change. So, if there was a very high incentive to litigate before the reference court. The maximum such award was 108 times the original award by the collector, and the median was about 1.6, and the average was about 4 times. So, in that sense, the new LARR Act formula is actually very much in accordance with what the courts were already awarding. It wasn't. Yeah, so so the law actually brought this into accordance with existing reality. Now, obviously, we expect that the courts sort of correct things at a certain level. So, at the higher court, hopefully, we don't see that many errors and that much increase. So, accordingly, we see that at the high court level, the increase in compensation likelihood is about 45.9%. Now, please note, it is not as if the same cases are having further increases. Usually what happens is, if the reference court has given the right amount of compensation, high court will not increase. It will either have no change, it may sometimes reduce. But in many cases, almost half of the cases, it was still increasing compensation. And likewise at the Supreme Court, again, we expect the High Court should have corrected all the errors, so people shouldn't really be winning again at the Supreme Court. But even at the Supreme Court level, in 30% of the cases, we have an increase in compensation. And again, High Court highest award was 700 times 70 times. So reference court highest award was 108 times, High Court highest award was 70 times, and from High Court to Supreme Court, the highest awards was 145 times the original. These are the outliers within the data set. So, yeah, I've explained this. So next, the second category of those where they are challenging the legitimacy of the land acquisition process per se. Within this category, a small category of people are challenging the constitutional validity of the law itself. Only 5%, which is understandable because there is a presumption of constitutionality for any law Parliament enacts. Parliament, as a representative of the people, is supposed to follow the Constitution. But in a very uncanny similarity, actually, High Court, if you look at when the law has actually been challenged, so within 5% of those 805 cases, when the law actually was challenged, both the High Court and the Supreme Court have actually found the statute unconstitutional in 31% of the cases, which comes to about 20 cases where both High Court and Supreme Court have found the law unconstitutional. These cases do not have an exact overlap. So in other words, there are cases where High Court found the law unconstitutional, but Supreme Court didn't. There are cases where both found the law unconstitutional. There are cases where the High Court found it constitutional, but the Supreme Court didn't. We look at those who challenge the legitimacy of the land acquisition procedure, that is statute okay, but the law hasn't been correctly applied to us. So within this category, if we look at the challenges to procedural irregularities, this is actually 1/3 of the entire data set. It's about 451 cases, of which 20, of which the cases involving constitutional validity was a part of this, and then these are 431 cases. If you look at the kinds of procedural challenges that are being brought before the courts, the first set, which is about a quarter of the cases, are about improper exercise of executive authority. In this, petitioners are claiming things like you've acted without authority under the statute, or you have acted in culpable exercise of power, which means that you had authority to do something, but you've done something more or something different than what was given. Or there has been the second set of cases involves about half of the cases are actually straightforward procedural non-compliance, which means that the text of the statute very clearly says that there is a notice requirement, notice must contain all of these conditions, but the notice doesn't contain all those things. The hearing has to be held in a certain manner. It hasn't been held in that particular manner, and so on. And the third set is misuse of the urgency clause. So actually, at least in Supreme Court litigation, because we are confined to this data set, this is not indicative of the kind of litigation that is before the high courts and the lower courts. But at least in the Supreme Court litigation, the challenge to misuse of urgency clause is relatively small as compared to its prominence in the conventional narrative. It's only 16.5% of the cases. And then we have the provision, so there is a chapter 7 under the Act which basically allows the government to acquire land for companies. And, again, this was also in the conventional narrative, there was this perception that, this was being widely misused. Singur and other cases brought this to the fore because essentially Part 7 provided more stringent requirements for land to be acquired for a company. But usually what was happening was that the government was acquiring land for companies pursuant to the requirements of Part 2 of the Act. And but we don't see a lot of challenge to this acquisition of land for companies. Only 38 cases in the entire data set before the Supreme Court involved such challenges. And finally, we had a subset of miscellaneous issues that were there. If you look at how the High Court and Supreme Court have decided, again, uncanny similarities, over 50% of the cases in this particular category, they are actually, upholding the petitioner's claims and saying that, yes, there are procedural irregularities. And similarly, at the Supreme Court level, which is actually more, at 57%, they are actually saying there are procedural irregularities. So the chances of a petitioner succeeding in these cases is also high at the Supreme Court level. And finally, a small subcategory of people also questioned the legitimacy of the purposes for which land was being acquired. This was only 6.2% of the total cases. How did the Supreme Court decide these challenges? in 16.5% of the cases, they invalidated because they have a very deferential review to public purpose. But what sort of came out from the data set is that actually people, most of the cases are not involving a challenge to the legitimacy of public purpose. People are accepting the purposes as being legitimate. And when they are challenging, it's actually a total of only 13 cases where the Supreme Court has invalidated on public purpose because it has had a very deferential review. So that brings us to the purpose-wise distribution of judgments. So about 30% of the cases, we don't actually have information on what constitutes. We don't have information on what purposes land has been acquired for. But for the remaining 70%, if you look at the set of cases, about half the cases involve acquisitions for planned development, infrastructure, industry, and affordable housing, as well as defense and educational institutions. 6 categories for which these challenges are being brought. Now, planned development usually refers to a project which has both residential and commercial aspects. Usually, planned development is essentially urbanization. And so that's really what's sort of coming out. And then, of course, we have infrastructure. Industry here, it includes everything from land acquired for a single factory to an industrial corridor to an industrial park and so on. And then we have housing, which is a category which is 9%, within which affordable housing for the socially and economically weaker sections of society is the largest category, but we also have about 1% of the claims for government housing and private residential housing. And finally, educational institutions. Now, interestingly here, what we will notice, and it's a little small, so I don't know if you're able to read it, but dams, mining, and irrigation together constitute only 5% of the total litigation before the Supreme Court. But as we know that, these are some of the biggest causes of displacement that have been recorded. So obviously, litigation is a sign of empowerment, and as we know, because the 1894 Act only allowed title holders to bring claims, whereas a lot of the people who are displaced by these projects may not have title to the land. So this litigation, I just want to stress this, does not sort of exhaust the kind of disputes that are being brought or showing where most of the contestation is. This is where most of the legal contestation before the Supreme Court is, but there is social and political contestation on these other issues. And we are going to speak about some of them in the later part of the day as well, when we talk about the land rights in the scheduled areas project. So then we come to the state and district-wise distribution of litigation. Here we find, so this corresponds, so once we disaggregated the petitions, so remember the 69 cases lead to 13,884 petitions. The 6 states which actually account for almost 3/4 of all litigation are Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Karnataka, Punjab, Tamil Nadu, and Delhi. Now, obviously, given how small Haryana, Punjab, and Delhi are, geographical and population size are not really what is explaining here. The first obvious reason is proximity to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is in Delhi, and Haryana, Punjab, and Uttar Pradesh are bordering states, and the ease of access to the Supreme Court, both because of physical proximity, but also, going to the Supreme Court requires deep pockets because you've been through a long litigation process and you need to hire senior advocates who'll plead your case and so on. So basically, that means that the people who are bringing these claims are people of certain means, but also, so that's the first and most obvious reason for what's going on. But if we look at the district-wise distribution of litigation, we get the second most important phenomenon, which is really urbanization. All of this litigation is coming about from peri-urban areas, which have been rapidly urbanized. And therefore, if we look at, the districts here, Noida, which leads the pack with 1,245 petitions, is, along with Gurgaon, Faridabad, Ghaziabad, these are all sort of within the national capital region, but all the other districts as well are either state capital districts like Mysore and Bangalore, and or important commercial centers like Nagpur and Indore in Maharashtra and MP. Jaipur, which is again a capital which is there. So these are all sort of either state capitals, commercial districts, highly urban districts. That's where the litigation is coming from. And the fact that 16.5% of all acquisitions that are being challenged are about planned development or urbanization, it means that that's what's bringing these claims as well. Now, if you look at, but if we disaggregate the petitions based on those who are seeking a fair compensation, as opposed to those who are challenging the legitimacy of the land acquisition process, we get some more interesting findings. So Haryana is really interesting because most of the claims are really about increased compensation. And I think that that's also because the Land Acquisition Act did not allow you to compensate for the change in land use. And what happens is that these are mostly agricultural lands which are being taken for urbanization, infrastructure, industrial development, and people want a share in the development pie. That's basically what they want. They see that tomorrow this land is going to fetch, we're going to develop it a certain value, the government a certain value. They want to be a part of that. So Haryana, which is really an outlier with that kind of litigation, but also we also have Punjab, which also has very high. The blue bar is basically the compensation litigation. The orange bar is the litigation where they're challenging the procedural irregularities within the acquisition process. So if you look at the orange bar, it's actually Uttar Pradesh and Karnataka which are leading the list. Once we disaggregate it. So there are interesting questions as to what is going on in the acquisition process there. And now this is again, information was not available for the entire data set, but this is basically, it gives us a sense of the geographical area that has been litigated in these cases. And here again, it's interesting because, like Haryana, which has got almost 18% of all litigation petitions, has only 3.7% of land, is giving us so much litigation, whereas Rajasthan, which has more than 30% of land that is being acquired, only 2% of it is in terms of the litigation petitions. So these are the interesting outliers, and very interestingly, the states that we have seen, like Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, states which are doing very well in ease of doing business indices and so on this year, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, they don't seem to have any litigation. So obviously the claimants there have not been able to bring claims. So because development is happening, they're doing well in ease of doing business and development indices, but there is no litigation. So there's a story here. So finally, we also looked at litigation under the LARR Act, what has been happening so far, and we looked at the 3 years that the Act has been in force. So all the litigation almost has been under Section 24 of the LARR Act, where people are basically using the retrospective clause to quash existing acquisitions, about 97% of the cases. This is actually 280 cases have been decided by the Supreme Court already, of which 200 cases pertain to the DDA, the Delhi Development Authority, which sort of confirms our proximity thesis is that probably the Delhi Development Authority acquisitions are being challenged and decided first just because they're here and close by, but other cases are also going to be decided soon. How did the Supreme Court decide? In about 95% of the cases, they invalidated the acquisition. So basically, Section 24 provides that, if there is a land that is being acquired pursuant to a pending land acquisition law, but 3 conditions are met, either one of 3 conditions are met, either that land has been acquired, but it's 5 years since the law came into force, before the law came into force, up to 5 years before the law came into force, if possession of the land has not been taken, or compensation has not been awarded, or compensation has been awarded but the claimants have not accepted, they've refused to accept the compensation, then they can go to court under this provision of the law and seek to invalidate the pending acquisition, and the Supreme Court in 95% of the cases has invalidated the acquisition. Just 1 second. In some cases, it has remitted the matter, the very small yellow bar, it has remitted the matter back to the lower court. But I think it would be safe to assume that, most of these cases it's been invalidating. So finally, to conclude, I think the first thing that sort of comes out is that the Land Acquisition Act, and this is there in more detail in the report, the Land Acquisition Act itself created a huge imbalance of power between the state and the private individual, which was embodied within the very text of the law. And what the LARR Act has done is that it has partially redressed this imbalance of power between the state and the private individuals. The imbalance of power came about first because the category of claimants under the land acquisition process was really small, only title holders could bring claims. And also because there was very little public participation, consent, or social impact assessment within the domain of the earlier law. So insofar as the LARR Act has expanded the category of legal claimants from title holders to livelihood losers, it has brought compensation provisions under the Act in accordance with existing realities, which is what the courts were doing anyways. And I just want to mention here something about the kinds of claims that were brought under the market value. So in the 90s, through a series of judicial precedent, actually the Supreme Court had made it very clear that the collector who typically uses circle rates to award the compensation that they must actually look at sale deeds as well. So there was a series of decisions, and many of the cases since then have actually involved. So the compensation challenges, if you will recall, were about 2/3 of the total cases. Within that, actually about 2/3 of the challenges are really about computation of the market value, the principle that has been used. And usually it's a question of whether circle rate or sale deeds, whether the right sale deeds have been taken into account, whether enough sale deeds have been taken into account. But the fact that sale deeds have to be taken into account was something that was laid down by the Supreme Court in the 90s. So what the LARR Act has done is basically incorporated that into the text of the law. And that I think is very important because, and that leads me to the next point, which is that, there is only so much that legal reform can do. Much of what there are limits to legal change. So unless we sort of back legal reform with administrative reforms, we are not really going to be able to redress the imbalance. For instance, the social impact assessment and consent provisions will not redress the existing inequities minus administrative reforms with respect to greater accountability and transparency of the government to act in accordance with the rule of law. And when we were trying to understand what was going on, we find that a lot of the times the collectors are not aware that they are actually supposed to look at sale deeds, that there is actually Supreme Court orders mandating them to look at sale deeds. They still look at the circle rates. So that's part of the problem, lack of awareness. The second part of the problem, however, is that even when they know, it's easier. The administrative structure is skewed in such a way that it incentivizes them to look at circle rates because it is an objective number that they can use. If they use a subjective evaluation, they may be subject to internal investigations and so on. So they prefer to play safe and then just go with the circle rates, even though they know that it's not the correct value, because they feel that otherwise it's a problem for them, and the litigant can always go to court later on and get the redress. So the choice is really between that. And but the second set of questions that come up is the administrative and bureaucratic reforms are very necessary, because if you remember, 1/3 of all cases are about procedural irregularities. About half of those cases are about errors which are more of incompetence rather than malfeasance. There are things about the fact that the notice has not been included all the relevant details. So skills training of the administration, ensuring that they know what they actually have to do, will help to really minimize a lot of conflict here, and also sort of logistical training as well. And then the second. So that's the first sort of major finding. The second finding is about the fact that the public purpose definition as it has been provided in the LARR Act was unnecessary. It expands the scope of legitimate public purposes beyond existing realities in sort of legitimizing many of those things which were actually not a subject of major acquisitions under existing law. And finally, we have brought about some legal reform. So it would be in the interests of government, if they want to minimize conflict, to not subvert it through the state amendments and so on, but actually let the LARR Act, insofar as that is in play, to actually see how it minimizes conflict. Because in some ways what the LARR Act has done is it has, hopefully it has translated some of the non-legal contestation into legal contestation by giving a voice to these categories of claimants who were excluded. But that being said, we do need these administrative reforms that I've just mentioned, and the public purpose thing is problematic. But beyond that, beyond land acquisition law, we need legal and administrative reform on other issues if we are actually going to make the land acquisition process more equitable and efficient. We have to improve land records. We have to update them. We have to remove title disputes. We have to try and figure that out. We have to record property rights of livelihood losers. There is this sense within society that only title is property right and others are just livelihood rights, but that's not true. Even the 1894 Act recorded easement rights, but it's just that the law itself recognizes non-title property rights, but we don't understand it as property rights. We have to actually record them as property rights on the title document as encumbrances with the records department. And finally, there has to be accurate price reporting in circle rates as well as in registration of sale transactions, and these are larger and reforms that we need to make. So I think I'll just end with that. And as I mentioned, this is obviously the Supreme Court litigation. It's been a huge data set over a long period of time, but it is only the tip of the iceberg with respect to total litigation under the high courts, with the civil courts, and also with the non-legal contestation. And we need to actually create systematic data to understand the causes of those conflict. only then will we be able to mitigate land conflict. But we hope, and this is, the team that has worked on this project are all here, and this is the hope that, this research will help us to understand these issues and with the goal of mitigating land conflict. Thank you very much.